This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 17. Gustavus Adolphus. We saw in discussing the Emperor Ferdinand II that his failure was mainly due to the discovery of a great military genius by Richelieu. The hiring of that genius by Richelieu in the interests of France and the launching of him also by Richelieu against the Catholic Emperor. The name of this genius was Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, but for his quite exceptional talents in the art of war, Ferdinand would have succeeded in making all Germans united under the Catholic imperial crown, and in making Catholicism permanently dominating in Europe. The astonishing victories of Gustavus destroyed that opportunity, and Richelieu, his paymaster, was principally responsible. Gustavus Adolphus was the immediate descendant of the man who had ousted the rightful king of Sweden from his throne. The royal family of Sweden was called Vasa. The Reformation in Sweden had followed the usual lines. The great nobles or landowners of that small country had looted the land and other wealth of the church, just as they did in England. They had been supported, as in England, by a small but enthusiastic minority of religious revolutionaries, and they had precariously established a Protestant government. The whole thing was done with more difficulty than in England, because it came later. There were rich monastic establishments working almost to the end of the 16th century in Sweden, because, in spite of one small clique of men aiming to fill their own pockets, there was a succession of erratic monarchs, whose individual eccentricity prevented a continuous policy, for there was something of madness in all the Vasa family. Now the legitimate heir to the kingdom of Sweden in the second generation of all this affair was strongly Catholic, and because he was hereditary king of Sweden, he was also the elected king of Poland, a country which, after much hesitation, had come down strongly on the Catholic side. This legitimate hereditary king of Sweden, Sigismund, thus became at one and the same time the king of Sweden and of Poland. Even strong Protestants in Sweden hesitated to make the full step of rebellion and refused to accept his sovereignty, for that would have been shocking to the ideas of the time. But, being determined to keep their church loot and at the same time to maintain the independence of Sweden so that her affairs should not be merged in those of Poland, they made the young king swear to respect all the institutions of Sweden and maintain the Reformation settlement of land in that country. Such a situation was too unstable to last. The vested interests created by the loot of the church in Sweden were, as in England, terrified lest a Catholic monarch should restore the church's wealth to its rightful owners, and they repudiated, in sight of their oaths, their legitimate king, and adopted for their candidate to the throne his usurping uncle. When the usurping uncle, who thus held the throne of Sweden against all right, died, he left a young heir by name Gustavus Adolphus, and that young heir was at once regarded by all those who had made their fortunes out of the religious revolution as their champion. For they did not know, what was soon to be proved, that he was not only the leader of anti-Catholic influence in his little country, a community not much larger than Scotland then was, at the most 1.5 million souls, but a man unique in his time for the power of molding and using an army force. Young Gustavus Adolphus began by making the wealthy men of his country impress by forcible conscription as great a force as so small a community could yield. He then crossed the Baltic and launched out into adventures on German and Polish soil to the south of that sea. He was occupied in fighting his cousin, the Catholic king of Poland, upon whose throne he was himself a usurper, when his reputation reached the ears of the great French Prime Minister Richelieu. Richelieu had that quality which one continually finds throughout history in men who decide the course of international affairs successfully. He could foresee the results of character. It is true that Gustavus Adolphus had already given proofs of talent, but on a small scale and in a small field. Richelieu had gambled, if gambled be the right word, on the chance of Gustavus proving to be what, in fact, he did prove to be, a captain of the first rank. Richelieu sent an agent to approach Gustavus during his Polish war and to offer him money on a large scale if he would direct the attack on Ferdinand, who was in the midst of his hitherto successful experiment of recapturing Germany and establishing the power of the emperor over the cities and smaller states. The first offer Richelieu made to Gustavus was high, 3 big tubs of gold. Gustavus, who is always represented to us as the champion of ideal causes, held out for 5. Richelieu was determined to secure his services and therefore agreed to the 5 tubs of gold. When this had been settled, and not before, Gustavus was ready to march. At first it looked as if the new situation would not make a very great change in the religious and political war among the Germans. Many of the German princes were jealous at seeing a Swede laying down a policy for them and enforcing it by his army. Some of them, though Protestant and northern, that is, far removed from Vienna, thought it was better policy to remain neutral. Moreover, they did not yet suspect, nor did Gustavus himself properly understand, what vast talent the Swedish king possessed in the trade of arms. This was soon to be manifest. The 30 Years' War between Ferdinand and the Protestants had been going on for more than 10 years. The critical point at the moment when Gustavus Adolphus entered the struggle was with the town of Magdeburg, of which I have just spoken. It was the lowest main crossing of the obstacle formed by the river Elbe, which prevented the emperor's armies working from the south to master the Baltic shore. Therefore, the imperial forces of Ferdinand were besieging Magdeburg. It will always be doubtful whether Gustavus Adolphus might or might not have relieved the town, and whether his failure to do so was due to personal prudence, that is, his conclusion that the risk of attempting it would be too great, or to the stubborn neutrality of the Protestant German princes who stood between him and the city. At any rate, he did not relieve it, and the rebel town upon which the eyes of all Protestant Europe had been attracted was stormed and sacked by the imperial general Tilly and his army. The most horrible barbarities were committed, and nearly the whole place was burned down. Though Tilly did his best to restrain the soldiery, he cannot be absolved from responsibility for the massacre which the rebels suffered. Gustavus Adolphus published an open defense of his failure to relieve the town, upon the value of which defense opinion is divided to this day. At any rate, shortly afterwards, the striking imperial successes had got him further Protestant alliances, and he began marching southward against the imperial armies, side by side with his Protestant German allies. It was at Breitenfeld, in the plain of North Leipzig, on the edge of the hills that bound this plain, that Euric woke up to the King of Sweden's genius. Then for the first time did Richelieu find himself amply justified in having hired him to reduce the power of the Habsburgs. Indeed, Richelieu found that he had purchased service too strong for him and likely to embarrass his own plans, for Gustavus Adolphus, after his German Protestant allies had broken, restored the battle and not only defeated the army of imperialists under Tilly, but virtually destroyed it. The remnant of the imperialists fought magnificently for hours, but only a fraction could be led in formation off the field. All the baggage had gone, and all the artillery. It looked at the moment as though this battle would make all Germany Protestant. For exactly a year, Gustavus Adolphus now gathered to himself greater and greater forces from all the rebel and Protestant elements in the empire, and advanced southwards and westwards. He went to the Rhine. He held a sort of imperial court at Frankfurt. He very nearly did what Bismarck was to do more than 200 years later, convert the German Empire from a Catholic to a Protestant power. The great powers of Europe paid him court as though he were already in possession of imperial authority, all this in quite a few months after that tremendous victory near Leipzig. As may be imagined, Richelieu was frightened by the unexpectedly great success of his hireling. He did what he could to save the Catholic cause in Germany, and he got verbal promises from the victor, but he doubted their being kept. He was thoroughly alarmed at the too great measure of success he had obtained by his right judgment of the military talents of the Swede. Gustavus Adolphus, having thus made himself supreme upon the Rhine, and having swept over the whole of north and center of Germany, proposed to turn upon the hereditary lands of Ferdinand II and to strike at the heart of the old imperial power. There was a moment in which it looked as if he might have seized Vienna itself. He crossed the Danube. He invaded Bavaria. The great Tilly died of wounds received in action, and it seemed as though the Catholic and imperial cause were now really lost forever in the Germanies. At that moment, in desperation, Ferdinand called upon the captain who had formerly led the imperial troops to victory, Wallenstein. It was a risk, for the army would follow Wallenstein in person rather than the emperor, and no one knew what Wallenstein would do if he should prove successful again. He was quite unscrupulous and was playing his own hand. Armies in those days were nearly all mercenary. They followed a leader for pay, and the imperial government was poor. But Wallenstein, thus recalled, held a name which worked miracles among his soldiers. Ferdinand then took the risk, and Wallenstein marched against Gustavus Adolphus, whose centre at the moment was Nordlingen, a nodal point in the communications between the Danube Valley and the north of Germany. Wallenstein refused to attack for a long time. He entrenched himself in the neighborhood of Nordlingen until at last he provoked the King of Sweden to attack him, almost exactly a year after the first spectacular victory of the Swedes at Breitenfeld. The shock came in 1632, on a day of fog and bewilderment. One may say that the Swedes had the best of it. Wallenstein lost his artillery and was tactically beaten, but there was no true decision, and the essential fact of the day was that Gustavus Adolphus happened to be killed in the turmoil. He probably fell through the accident of losing his way in the fog and getting surrounded by a detachment of enemies. At any rate, the death of the great Protestant hero shook the whole fabric of his enormous but ephemeral success. What followed was a series of ups and downs. The Swedish prestige could not be permanently maintained. The imperial forces recaptured a sufficient ascendancy to dominate, more or less, their opponents, but not to dominate them completely. The emperor, as we saw in the last chapter, was compelled, owing to the intrigues and surreptitious treasons of the time, to give up the essential of the whole affair, the restitution of church goods. Further, Ferdinand discovered that Wallenstein was likely to betray him, for the great but unscrupulous captain had all the strength now of an independent monarch, and Ferdinand was determined to reassert himself. His Spanish allies, that is, the other branch of the Habsburg house, furnished a new army, and the emperor behaved with admirable courage and tenacity during the crisis, in which the more than suspected treason of Wallenstein threatened his throne and his life. Ferdinand had the strength of will and the judgment to dismiss that too dangerous nominal subject who was really his rival. Wallenstein then betrayed the emperor and entered into communications with the Swedes, who were still the nucleus of the anti-imperial forces. But the emperor, in this moment, found men to serve him. Wallenstein was bearded in his quarters, even in the moment of his betrayal, and was put to death by a group of officers in the imperial service. His second in command had already proclaimed his own loyalty to the emperor. With the death of Wallenstein, the emperor was free from his principal danger within, but lost his most talented commander. The struggle dragged on, lingering until after Ferdinand's death. The 30 Years' War did not end until the general pacification of the mid-century, in the treaties which are usually known as the Peace of Westphalia. These were signed just before the triumph of the English Revolution against Charles I, and one may say that, after 1650, Europe was finally settled into the opposing cultures which it has since maintained. North Germany, thanks to the efforts of Gustavus Adolphus, and in spite of his death 18 years before, thanks also to the statesmanship of Richelieu, the paymaster of Gustavus Adolphus, who was also by this time dead, was to be securely Protestant, and its princes and lords and cities to keep the loot of religion. Catholicism in South Germany was saved nominally, and the power of the emperor was still maintained, but it had failed to make a united country of its subjects. The great Swedish general had done his work well.